You're fired. Chloe Bennet ran the cloth over the counter for what felt like the 100th time that evening. It was the third wipe down in 10 minutes, and she couldn't help glancing up at the clock again. Almost closing time. Joe's Diner, the little roadside spot where she'd been holding down a job for the past couple of years, was nearly empty. Business had been dragging all night, hardly any customers, and the tip jar showed it. And right now, that mattered more than ever. Rent was coming due next week, and her savings weren't exactly inspiring confidence. Then the bell above the door chimed, cutting through the quiet. Chloe looked up to see a lanky man step hesitantly into the diner. His clothes were faded and rumpled, his boots kicked up with dust, and his hair looked like it hadn't seen a comb in days. Despite all that, he had this quiet kind of strength in the way he stood, but his face told another story. He looked like someone who'd been dragging a lifetime of weight behind him. He walked up slowly to the counter, cautious, like he wasn't quite sure if he'd be welcome. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a few wrinkled bills. "Excuse me, miss," he said, voice rough around the edges but polite. "What can I get for $5? Chloe's eyes flicked to the menu board. The cheapest item was at least $8. 5 wouldn't stretch far. But the look in his eyes, tired, worn, human, made her decision simple. "You're in luck," she said with a warm smile. "We've got a special going tonight, full meal for $5. His eyes widened a bit, surprised, like he couldn't quite believe she wasn't joking. "Really?" "Absolutely," she replied, already punching in the order before he had a chance to protest. Within a few minutes, she placed a steaming hot plate in front of him. He stared at the food, then looked up at her, stunned. "You didn't have to do this," he said softly. Chloe gave a little shrug. "Everyone deserves a hot meal now and then." For just a moment, the tight lines on his face softened. A hint of a smile appeared as he reached for his fork, but before he could take a bite, a sharp voice sliced through the air. "Chloe." Doug, the manager, was striding over with that all-too-familiar look, equal parts irritation and suspicion. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" he barked, glaring at the food on the counter. Chloe felt her gut twist. "I paid for it out of my own pocket," she said, keeping her tone steady. Doug snorted. "This isn't a soup kitchen. If you want to hand out meals to vagrants, do it on your own time." Her fists clenched at her sides. "He's a veteran." Doug rolled his eyes like that made zero difference. "Still not my problem." Then, without warning, he grabbed the plate off the counter and dumped it straight into the trash. The entire diner went silent. Chloe froze, watching the food slide down into the garbage bin. The veteran didn't move. His hands rested calmly in his lap, his face unreadable. Doug, meanwhile, dusted off his hands like he'd just thrown away trash instead of someone's dignity. "Now get back to work," he snapped. Something snapped inside Chloe. Her blood boiled. "You're disgusting," she said through clenched teeth. Doug smirked, full of spite. "And you're out of a job." She blinked, stunned for half a second, maybe she'd heard him wrong, but then she saw the look on his face, arms crossed, grin spreading. "You're firing me?" she asked, trying to keep her voice level. Doug gave a curt nod. "You bet. Grab your stuff and leave." Chloe's eyes darted around the diner, searching for someone, anyone, who might speak up. But the other workers kept their heads low, glued to their stations. The few customers left whispered to each other but stayed silent. Then the veteran slowly stood, looking directly at Doug. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. Doug let out a dismissive snort. "I don't owe you anything, old man." The man didn't react. He simply nodded once, then turned to Chloe. "Thank you for your kindness," he said. Chloe offered a faint smile, even though her stomach was churning. "I wish I could have done more." "You've already done more than most," he replied. And with that, he turned and walked out into the night. Chloe turned back to Doug, her jaw tight. "You're going to regret this." Doug let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Highly doubt it." Grabbing her coat, Chloe walked out into the cold, unsure of what came next. She had no job now, no safety net, and not the slightest idea what she was supposed to do from here. What Chloe didn't know, what no one in that diner knew, was that everything was about to shift in ways none of them could have imagined. And it would all happen within a single day. As she made her way home, her breath came out in pale clouds that vanished into the frigid night air. Each step felt heavier than the last, the reality of what had just happened settling like a stone in her chest. She hadn't lost her job for slacking off or making a mistake. She'd lost it for doing the right thing, for showing kindness. And somehow, that made it even worse. It didn't just feel unjust, it was unjust. She reached her apartment, which was barely more than a box with a bed, a chipped counter, and a tiny fridge wedged into the corner. Dropping her coat onto the back of the only chair, she collapsed onto the bed without even taking off her shoes. Her eyes landed on the stack of unopened bills teetering on the edge of the table. Rent was due in 7 days, and with her current bank balance, she had no clue how she was going to pull it off. That night, sleep barely touched her. She tossed, turned, stared at the ceiling, and kept replaying everything in her mind like a cruel film loop. Doug's smug grin. The sickening sound of the food hitting the trash. The way the veteran, Luke, she'd later learn, had walked out without anger, just a quiet kind of grace that made the whole scene feel even heavier. The more she thought about it, the more it burned. The unfairness. The humiliation. The silence from everyone who watched and said nothing. By the time the sun crept in through the blinds, Chloe knew she had no choice but to start searching for work. She pulled on her thickest coat, tucked her resume copies under one arm, and stepped out into the cold morning. She walked for hours, going door to door, stopping into shops, restaurants, and offices, anywhere that might need help. She filled out application after application, but every conversation ended the same way. "We're not hiring right now. Sorry." By midday, her feet were sore and her fingers numb from the chill. Somehow, she found herself back near Joe's diner. She had no idea why she'd ended up there. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was unfinished business. She didn't plan to go inside, she just stood across the street, staring at the place like it was part of someone else's story. From the outside, everything looked the same. The same chipped paint. The same dusty windows. The same neon sign buzzing faintly. Like nothing had happened. Then a low, deep rumble rolled through the air. Chloe turned toward the sound, confused. A military convoy, jeeps and armored vehicles, rolled steadily down Main Street. In this sleepy little town, that was about as rare as snow in July. People stepped out of shops, shading their eyes and watching as the convoy came to a gradual stop, right in front of Joe's diner. Chloe's heart skipped. Her stomach tightened without knowing why. Inside the diner, Doug was carrying on with his usual routine. He didn't give a second thought to firing Chloe. In fact, if anything, he felt a sense of relief about it. Staff were replaceable. He'd find someone else by next week. The bell above the door jingled, and Doug turned, expecting to see a regular customer. But it wasn't just one customer. A tall man stepped through the door in full military dress, polished metals shining on his chest. He radiated command just by standing still. Behind him, a dozen Marines filed in, boots hitting the floor in perfect sync. Their presence was immediate and unmistakable. The room fell into stunned silence. Doug blinked, caught completely off guard. "Can I help you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The officer's gaze swept across the room like a searchlight. "We're looking for Chloe Bennett." The entire diner went still. Doug hesitated. She doesn't work here anymore." The officer didn't react. His tone remained unchanged. "We know. Before Doug could ask anything else, the bell rang again. Luke stepped through the doorway. But this wasn't the man from last night. He stood tall now, every inch of him composed. His marine dress uniform was immaculate, ribbons and medals displayed with pride. Doug's face paled slightly. Luke. Luke didn't even glance at him. Instead, he turned to the officer by his side and said clearly, "This is Colonel Marcus Hale. And these men behind us? They're my brothers." Doug looked from one face to another, completely out of his depth. I don't understand. Luke let out a slow, steady breath. Yesterday, a young woman showed me kindness when no one else did. She offered me a meal. Treated me like a person. And for that, she lost her job. Colonel Hale took a step forward, his voice low but firm. Luke Morrison isn't just another veteran. He's a highly decorated Marine. He's risked his life to save others, many others. And the way he was treated in this establishment is completely unacceptable. Doug's fists curled tightly at his sides. "Look, I didn't know." "You didn't care," Luke cut in sharply before he could finish. A thick silence fell over the room, the kind that makes the air feel heavier. Then, Colonel Hale shifted his gaze toward the front window and spotted Chloe still standing just outside. "Chloe Bennett," he called out, his voice firm and clear. Chloe froze in place as every head inside the diner turned toward her. For a second, she thought about turning and walking away. The spotlight, the tension, it all felt like too much. But there was something in the colonel's tone, solid and commanding, but not harsh, that made her legs move before her mind could catch up. She stepped through the door, the bell jingling above her as she entered. The warmth inside did little to settle the nerves buzzing under her skin. Doug's eyes met hers, and his face had gone noticeably pale. Colonel Hale gave her a small, approving nod. There was the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. "Miss Bennett," he began, "we heard about what happened yesterday. But more importantly, we heard about what you did for Luke." Chloe's eyes flicked to Luke, who gave her a quiet, reassuring nod. The colonel continued without pause. "We need people like you. The kind who do the right thing even when there's no recognition or reward. We'd like to offer you a job." Chloe blinked, her breath catching in her throat. "A job?" she repeated, stunned. "Not in the military," he clarified with a slight smile. "We run a program designed to help veterans reintegrate into civilian life. We need compassionate, steady hands to assist with counseling, job placements, and outreach. People like you, who understand the value of simple human kindness, can make all the difference." Her mind was spinning. Less than a day ago, she'd been fired for doing something she believed in. And now? Now the United States Marine Corps was standing in front of her, offering her a new purpose. Doug scoffed from behind the counter, voice dripping with sarcasm. "You've got to be kidding me. She's just a waitress." Colonel Hale's expression darkened as his gaze swung sharply toward Doug. "And yet she did more for one of our brothers in a single evening than you have likely done for anyone in your entire life." The room went quiet. Chloe stared down at the business card now resting in her hand, her pulse thudding in her ears. Just yesterday, her world had fallen apart. Now, with one unexpected offer, everything felt different, possible. She stood still in the middle of the diner, gripping the card as if it might vanish if she let go. The weight of the moment pressed down on her shoulders, yet it didn't feel crushing. It felt real. She'd spent the last day questioning what came next. Now the answer was standing right in front of her, wearing Marine uniforms, offering her something she never even knew she was looking for. Doug let out a bitter, empty laugh and shook his head. "This is absurd," he muttered. "You can't just march in here and hand her a job. She's not even remotely qualified for whatever position you're talking about." Colonel Hale didn't even flinch. "Actually, Mr. Harper," he said smoothly, "she's more qualified than you could ever comprehend. Then he turned back to Chloe, and this time his voice softened. This isn't some handout, Miss Bennet. We're not offering this out of pity. We need people with heart. People who stand up when it matters, even when it costs them something. Chloe felt a lump form in her throat. His words hit deeper than she expected. Doing the right thing had never really paid off before, if anything, it usually came with consequences. But now, for once, it seemed like someone saw her. And it wasn't just anyone, it was people who commanded respect, people who knew what sacrifice looked like. Luke stepped closer, his presence grounded and calm. Chloe, he said, these men are the reason I'm still breathing. I fought beside them. I bled with them. And yesterday, you showed me something I hadn't felt in years, the kind of loyalty I once gave them. His voice didn't waver. You didn't just give me a meal. You reminded me that there are still people out there who care. Doug let out a loud, dismissive scoff. Oh please. Spare me the speech. Luke's jaw tensed, but before he could speak, Colonel Hale stepped in. Is that funny to you, Mr. Harper? His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, something sharp and dangerous enough to make Doug's face twitch. You fired a woman who showed basic human decency to a man who risked his life for this country. And now, that same man stands before you, decorated, in uniform, surrounded by those he served with. The colonel's voice dropped, cold and deliberate. Tell me. Does it still seem funny? Chloe's heart thudded hard in her chest as she turned over the weight of what had just been offered to her. Was this really happening? Could she honestly leave everything she'd ever known behind and step into something completely new? She drew in a slow, steady breath, her fingers tightening around the card like it might slip through them if she didn't hold on tight. The choice felt enormous, but somewhere deep inside, she already knew it wasn't really a choice at all. Her time at Joe's diner had ended the moment Doug threw that plate in the trash. He'd made it crystal clear, there was no future for her there. But the way the Marines had stood beside Luke, and more surprisingly, stood beside her, had stirred something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose. The following morning, Chloe made her way to the address printed neatly on Colonel Hale's card. It led her just outside of town to a large brick building she'd somehow never noticed before. The parking lot was nearly full, with a mix of civilian cars and official military vehicles. She paused outside the entrance, nerves fluttering in her stomach. Then, squaring her shoulders, she stepped inside. The lobby was clean and open, sunlight pouring through tall windows and warming the modern space. Behind the reception desk, a friendly-looking woman looked up and smiled as Chloe approached. You must be Chloe Bennet, she said warmly. Chloe gave a small nod. Yeah. That's me. They're expecting you, the receptionist replied, gesturing down a hallway. Head straight through. Trying to steady herself, Chloe gave a quiet thanks and walked toward the hall. At the end, she stepped into a spacious office where Colonel Hale was already standing. He offered her a firm, confident handshake as she entered. Glad you came, he said. Chloe returned the handshake, though hers was far less certain than his. I figured. I owed it to myself to at least hear what you had in mind. He motioned toward the chair across from his desk. Good, he said. Because I think this is exactly where you're meant to be. As she eased into the seat, Chloe let her eyes wander around the room. The walls were filled with framed photos, Marines in both uniform and casual clothes, all smiling. There were plaques and medals on display, reminders of battles fought and lives changed. But what caught her attention wasn't the military honors, it was a handwritten sign on the desk in simple black ink. No one left behind. Colonel Hale followed her gaze and gave a small nod. That's the heart of what we do here, he said. We look after our own. Not just the ones still serving, but all of them. Even the ones the world tends to forget about. Chloe's thoughts immediately turned to Luke, how he'd walked into the diner with nothing but a few crumpled dollars and years of invisible weight on his shoulders. She realized she'd never really considered what happened to veterans after the uniforms were packed away. But now, she couldn't not think about it. "So, what exactly would I be doing here?" she asked. Colonel Hale leaned forward slightly, his tone both serious and sincere. "Our program helps vets navigate life after service. Some need jobs. Some need housing. Others just need a reminder that they still matter." He paused for a moment to let that land. "We partner with local businesses, government departments, volunteers, anyone willing to help make sure no one falls through the cracks. Your role would involve outreach, job placement, and most importantly, being someone they can count on. Someone who cares." Chloe hesitated. Her hands fidgeted slightly in her lap. "I've never done anything like this before. I mean, I don't have experience." "You have the kind that counts," Hale said without missing a beat. "You care. And honestly, that's more than enough to start." She took a slow breath and looked up. "And Luke?" "He's already on board," the colonel said, his lips curling into a smile. "Turns out he's got a lot to give, he just needed someone to remind him of that." Chloe felt warmth rise in her chest at the thought. The idea of working side by side with Luke, of helping others like him, it no longer felt foreign. It felt right. She gave a slow nod, more to herself than to anyone else. "All right," she said softly. "I'm in." Colonel Hale's grin widened. "Welcome to the team." From the moment Chloe stepped into her new role, she poured everything she had into the job. She dove headfirst into the work, eager to learn and determined to make an impact. Whether it was filling out forms, coordinating with local businesses, or simply learning to listen with empathy, she picked it up quickly. In just a few weeks, she crossed paths with veterans from every background, some who had only recently returned to civilian life, and others who had been battling their own demons for years. Each person brought a unique story. Each one carried invisible scars and struggles. And for the first time in a long while, Chloe felt like she wasn't just clocking in and out, she was making a real, lasting difference. One afternoon, while setting up for an upcoming job fair, Chloe felt a light tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Luke standing there. Only this time, he looked different, confident, grounded. His polo shirt was crisp with the organization's logo, his hair neatly trimmed, and he stood tall with a presence that radiated quiet strength. "Hey," he said with a small smile. "Hey yourself," Chloe replied, returning the smile. "How are things?" Luke glanced around the room, taking it all in. "It's surreal," he admitted. "For the longest time, I truly believed my life was over. Like I didn't matter anymore. And then you showed up." He held her gaze. "You changed everything, Chloe." Her chest tightened at the words. "I didn't do anything special," she said softly. "I just did what anyone should do." "Maybe so," Luke replied, "but you were the only one who actually did." Chloe didn't know what to say. Words felt too small for a moment like that. Instead, she simply reached out and gave his hand a gentle squeeze. That evening, as Chloe locked up the center, she stepped outside and paused to take in the view. The sky above was brushed in shades of orange and violet, the last light of the day stretching out over the town she used to think of as just another place to get through. But now it felt like something more. A second chance. A fresh start. She pulled out her phone, scrolled to Colonel Hale's number, and tapped out a message. "Thank you for believing in me." The response came back almost immediately. "We don't leave good people behind." Chloe smiled as she slipped her phone back into her coat pocket. She used to see herself as just another face in the background, just another person trying to survive. Now she knew she was part of something bigger. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she truly belonged. 6 months later, Chloe sat at her desk, staring at the growing stack of paperwork in front of her. Life at the Veteran Transition Center had been fast-paced and intense, equal parts rewarding and exhausting. There were days she went home completely drained. But even then, it was the most meaningful work she had ever done. She'd gone from serving food at a roadside diner to helping people rebuild the broken pieces of their lives, and somehow, that shift had changed her in ways she couldn't quite put into words. Beyond her office walls, the center was buzzing with activity. Veterans moved through the halls, some heading to job interviews, others sitting down for therapy or simply dropping by for a cup of coffee and a warm conversation. Chloe had learned something important along the way: sometimes, being heard mattered just as much as any paycheck or shelter. A quiet knock broke through her thoughts. She looked up and saw Luke standing in the doorway, hands casually tucked in his pockets. There was something steady and calm in his expression, a version of him she wouldn't have recognized a few months ago. "Got a minute?" he asked. Chloe smiled and gestured toward the chair across from her. "For you." "Always." Luke stepped in and took a seat, his gaze thoughtful. "Tomorrow's the big day," he said. Chloe nodded. It was. Tomorrow marked the center's first big public event, a community open house meant to bring veterans together with local employers, support services, and the town itself. And it was her project. She had planned every detail. This event was Chloe's brainchild, and she had poured her heart and soul into every piece of it. "Everything's in place," she said, though a hint of doubt crept into her voice. "At least. I hope it is." Luke chuckled, his expression easy. "You've got this." Chloe took a moment to really look at him. The change in him over the past several months had been nothing short of incredible. When they first met, Luke had been barely holding it together, just trying to make it through each day. Now he was a pillar at the center, guiding younger vets, offering support, and even leading outreach efforts for those still finding their footing. "I'm proud of you, Luke," she said, sincerity in every word. He smiled, small, but real. "I wouldn't be where I am if it weren't for you." She shook her head gently. "You're giving me too much credit. You did the hard part. I just reminded you of what was already there." Luke nodded, a flicker of emotion passing over his face. "Well, it goes both ways," he said. "You helped me, but this place helped you too." Chloe couldn't argue with that. She'd taken this job thinking she was showing up to help others, but the truth was, it had saved her too. After years of barely scraping by, thinking she didn't matter, she now woke up each morning with purpose. She was building something. Something real. They sat in a shared silence for a beat, comfortable, unspoken understanding between them. Then Luke stood and gave her a soft nod. "See you tomorrow." She watched him walk out, then let out a long breath. Tomorrow mattered, not just to her, not just to the team, but to every veteran who would walk through those doors hoping for a fresh start. The next morning, Chloe arrived early. The center had been completely transformed. Colorful banners now lined the walls, tables had been set up for employers and support groups, and volunteers moved around with quiet urgency, setting up refreshments, checking materials, arranging handouts. By noon, the first veterans began to arrive. Chloe watched them carefully as they entered, moving from booth to booth, having quiet conversations, picking up brochures, asking questions. Some looked a little unsure, hesitant about whether they belonged. That's why she was there. She moved through the space with calm purpose, smiling, shaking hands, offering directions and encouragement. She became the steady heartbeat in a room full of nervous energy. In one corner, she spotted Luke laughing with a small group of younger vets, swapping stories and cracking jokes. Across the room, Colonel Hale was deep in discussion with a government official, most likely working on ways to expand funding for the center's future. Then, near the entrance, Chloe saw a man who stood out, not because she recognized him, but because his body language was painfully familiar. He hovered by the doorway, hands shoved deep into the pockets of a weathered jacket, eyes scanning the room with uncertainty. He looked like he wasn't sure whether he belonged here. Chloe knew that posture. She had seen it before. She felt it before. She walked over and greeted him with a soft, open smile. First time. The man glanced at her, then looked past her toward the buzz of activity inside. Yeah, he admitted. I wasn't sure this place was for someone like me. Chloe nodded slowly, her voice gentle. I get that. But the truth is, everyone in there has felt that same way at some point. And trust me, not a single one of them regrets walking through that door. He stood frozen for a moment longer, then finally let out a breath and took a step forward. Chloe watched as one of the volunteers welcomed him in and led him to a booth. A quiet wave of satisfaction rose in her chest. This was what she was meant to do. That evening, as the last few guests trickled out and the lights dimmed, Chloe stepped outside into the cool twilight. She looked up at the sky, now painted in deep purples and fading golds. It was peaceful. A moment later, she heard footsteps beside her. Luke joined her, hands tucked in his jacket pockets, standing just like he had on that very first night they'd met. Not bad, huh? He said, glancing sideways at her. Chloe let out a soft, content laugh. Not bad at all. Luke nodded toward the building behind them. You know this was all you, right? Luke said, nodding toward the building behind them. You made this happen. You built something real, Chloe. She shook her head gently, the corner of her mouth lifting. No, she said, we built something real. Luke's smile widened, and then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small and carefully folded. He held it out to her. Chloe raised an eyebrow, curious. What's that? Something I've held onto for a while now, he said softly. She took the napkin and slowly unfolded it. Her breath caught the second she realized what it was. The receipt, from that night at the diner. The night she gave him a meal when no one else would. She stared down at the faded ink, her chest tightening. I kept it as a reminder, Luke said, his voice low. That night. I felt invisible. Like I didn't matter anymore. And then you, he paused, locking eyes with her, you showed me I was wrong. Chloe swallowed hard. Luke. He smiled again, this time with quiet gratitude, and gently patted her shoulder before turning to head back inside. Chloe stood there for a moment longer, her fingers trembling slightly as she stared down at the worn slip of paper. One single meal. That's all it had taken to change everything. And now, her mission was clear, keep paying that kindness forward, one life at a time. In a world that moves faster by the day, where people are often too busy to notice the struggles of others, kindness can feel like an afterthought, an outdated virtue. But Chloe's journey is proof that it still matters. Doing the right thing isn't always easy. In fact, sometimes it costs you something. But as this story shows, the ripples of even the smallest act of compassion can reach farther than we ever expect. Maybe you've been in that position yourself, forced to choose between standing up for someone or staying silent. Maybe it was speaking out against injustice. Offering a helping hand to a stranger. Or simply listening when someone needed to be heard. In a society that often rewards ambition over empathy, choosing compassion can feel like swimming against the current. But look at what one meal did. It didn't just change Luke's path, it rewrote Chloe's entire future. This story is more than just a feel-good moment. It's a powerful reminder that your actions matter, even when no one's watching. The kindness you offer today could be the moment that saves someone's tomorrow. If each of us took a little more time to notice, to reach out, to care, the world could look very different. So let me ask you, do you believe in the power of kindness? If you do, hit 1 in the comments below. And if stories like this give you hope, subscribe to Uncover Tales, where we shine a light on real-life heroes proving that doing good is never in vain. Because kindness? It's more than a choice. It's what makes us human.